Smita, are we starting now? Or we got another couple of minutes to go? Okay, so I think we are live, John.
Perfect.
So a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for this webinar today. We're very happy and privileged to have with us John Gloster, who's currently the Chief Quality and Performance Officer and the Board Advisor for Sports Village India. So Sports Village India is a firm that we collaborate a lot with at all our schools to deliver high quality sporting programs and coaching for our children across various grades. John is obviously a very well-known figure in India. And I think we all remember when he was the head physiotherapist for the Indian cricket team. So I'm sure he has lots of stories to tell us whenever he has the time about his time in Indian cricket. He's also been worked extensively with international cricket for the last 22 years across various countries, and he's been with Rajasthan Royals as their head physiotherapist right from inception. Um, John's from Australia, but for the last 15 years or so, he's been based in India, and we welcome John to this webinar, and we hope to learn a lot from him in terms of the importance of exercise and the importance of nutrition and the impact that physical exercise at this point in time will have on children. So welcome, John.
Oh, wonderful! Thanks, Simon, and I really appreciate the introduction. And like you alluded to, fortunately, I've been involved in both ends of the spectrum, I suppose we can call it. I've been heavily involved in the elite level sport now in this country for 15 years, working with Indian team, Rajasthan Royals. I also on the advisory board and head of sports science and sports medicine for the Go Sports Foundation, which is nurturing the Olympians as well. So I've had a lovely experience at the top of the pyramid all over the world, but I've also had this incredible experience of where I see the greatest value now, which is working at the bottom of the pyramid with kids, with grassroots sports, with physical education, because I believe the future of this country's sporting outcomes, but also the future of this country's health and wellness outcomes have to start there. So for me, that's just as exciting and just as challenging, but also just as rewarding as working with some of the greatest athletes and cricketers the world has ever known. So I'm very fortunate to have this platform to be able to speak to the kids, the parents, all the key stakeholders amongst the organization, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, sir.
Okay. So, I was really looking forward to this interaction with you, John. I've been a keen sportsman all my life, tennis, football, various sports. Now, of course, I love to do a workout pretty much every day. It feels like my meditation time, and if I don't work out, then I feel, as if there's something missing from my day. Having said that, I imagine it's going to be even more difficult for children because their natural instinct is to be running around, playing games, meeting with friends, being extremely physically active throughout the day. And they've all been trapped at home for the last almost 2 months. So could you just start by sharing your thoughts around the importance of exercise, especially for our children during this entire lockdown phase?
Yeah, look, for me, right at the moment, the top of the list, I think probably has to be immunity. And we know that the relationship that exercise and immunity have, so given that we're surrounded by, COVID-19, now is probably the best time to be really focusing whatever's going to boost our immunity more than anything else. So exercise for me is for immunity, but also for mental health. The physical side is equally as important, but they're the two sort of components we haven't really factored in previously. We've always understood why physical activity and movement and being active for kids has been important from a physical perspective, but we often haven't equated it to immunity boosting and then also the positive mental health outcomes that we're having to focus on during this period particularly. So, whenever I sort of think about, the constraints of where we are at the moment, I need to consider, especially for our athletes as well, that often we're all under difficult and different physical constraints in terms of space compared to our counterparts and colleagues overseas. So we need to factor that in. But then it just becomes a matter of us just being more creative with how we use this space, how we encourage our kids and what we do within that space. I keep coming back to the same story that, whenever we feel that we're hard done by and this is a tough time, I was one of the first people, fortunately, who was allowed to go and visit Nelson Mandela's cell on Robben Island when it was first opened up in the early 1990s after his release. And seeing his cell, and it makes me think of it now, that 8 foot by 7 foot cell where he spent 17 or 18 years, all but a couple of hours a day in that, the confines of that. And one of the things that he talked a lot about that kept him sane and the key to his peace of mind, as he called it, and that dissipated the tension, was exercise. So he put a big emphasis on getting through his periods within that confined space. He found solitude in his own thoughts through exercise and being physically fit. So there's no doubt that the role of physical fitness, exercise, movement plays in maintaining a healthy mind for our kids, maintaining a healthy and robust immunity system for our kids. I've always said that movement is medicine, and I'll continue to say that, and movement is at the core of all learning, particularly for kids. And I've said this in my talks before, where most educators feel that learning starts from the shoulders up. But I challenge that. I feel that all movement starts from the shoulders down, because it's through movement that we learn. All learning is driven by movement. So it's really important that we don't forget that during this period. Young people, we know, particularly sort of under the ages of 15, need 60 minutes a day of what we call moderate to intense physical activity a day. Now, that can be in a single episode or short bouts of exercise and activity, but it is required. And it's required because it's what fuels our mental growth. It's what fuels our neurological diet, so to speak. It's what makes all the little neurons grow, the connectivity. So people often equate mental health and mental growth with an academic sort of procedure, but it's not. It's often just purely through movement. I think if at the basis of it all is that you want better cognitive function or you want better academic outcomes for your kids, then it has to start with movement. So that's a really strong argument to say that our kids should be moving. We know that things like retention of information, we know things like attentiveness, all those things are driven by movement and having kids being mobile. Now, at the moment, we're all sitting for all these extended long periods in front of screens. And so health outcomes, and particularly mental health outcomes, will be negative because of the lack of movement. So purely on the back of that, we need to be moving and encouraging our kids to move. And then obviously there's the physical side as well, putting stresses through bone, stresses through muscle, boosting our cardiorespiratory system, particularly our respiratory system at the moment, which needs to be strong and robust, given this is a respiratory disease that we're surrounded by. So, for me, there's a few reasons there that fitness and movement and keeping kids active should be at the top of the agenda.
Great. So I completely agree with you. In fact, in all our schools and preschools, wherever we have launched the virtual preschooling or virtual schooling, we've tried to bring in a balance of making sure that while there is an emphasis on academics, there is also an emphasis on doing some sport or physical activity or some kind of a, extracurricular activity on a daily basis for the child.
Excellent.
Because, it's so critical to maintain that balance, like you said, above the shoulders and below the shoulders.
And I think you're right. I think the word you've spot on there is balance. We've got to balance out the unusual amount of time that these children are confined to an indoor space
Mm-hmm.
and to screens purely because of where we are. We need to balance that out with something else to counteract that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm encouraging it, and I'll continue to encourage it, more so because of the other longer term outcomes that we need to be aware of here. You know, to keep a child inside for 2 months, 3 months at a time is unusual. Okay, so and there will potentially be some long-term negative outcomes for children, not just physical, but also mental, like I said before, that we need to be aware of. And it's certainly something that we're addressing with all of our cricketers and all of our, all of our athletes that I'm involved in. But it's equally as important for our kids to stimulate our minds at the same time. Now, mind stimulation for me comes through movement, but we also need to understand that the process sometimes needs to be, it is often driven by a tech platform. So there is a benefit of using technology to encourage movement. And we're trying to sort of get that out there as well, that there are ways to get kids engaged through technology, but with movement at the core of it, or activity and physical activity at the core of it.
Yeah, since you mentioned that point, John, I think what we've done with Sports Village is take their the app that they have created, and we've integrated it with our digital offering to our students, so that then all the content which is there on the Sports Village app is now available to all our children. And I think that's a great addition to the overall offering that we're giving to children when it comes to the whole physical education side of the piece. I had one quick follow-up question for you in terms of the importance of exercise. Do you differentiate, or do you think we should approach the whole physical piece for preschoolers different from the way we look at the same for children in the higher grades, or the approach should more or less be the same?
I think that, as I said before, the core of it is just about movement and keeping kids moving. But this is a really good opportunity also to start building some of our foundation skills. And like I said before, the same messaging that I'm giving to our athletes in cricket is let's use this time wisely. The one thing we don't have, or often we don't have enough of, is time. Time is always the excuse why we can't do things. Whereas now we've got more than enough time. So let's use this time wisely. And this is a perfect opportunity, particularly for the kids that want to go on to a sport, to really work on the foundations of sport. Now that varies through different age groups, but the critical thing here is that between that sort of early movers, sort of 3 till sort of around 10, 8, 9, 10 years of age, this is the time to build the foundations and what we call the developing the motor competence and the physical literacy of our kids. Because once we have those skills, we have them for life. If we don't develop those skills before the age of about 10, then we can never acquire them later on in life, no matter how much we want to. Okay, so the programming has to start now. So by that, I mean the foundation skills being kicking, hopping, jumping, running, catching, so they're the basics that we can really work on. And they're also then built around even pre-foundation skills such as balance, coordination, things like that. So this is the opportunity that we may never get again to really work on some of these basics, and we have the time to do it. And once they're in place, they're with you for life. And then you can build on those foundations as an athlete, as a cricketer, or just for fun later on in life. The other opportunity we now have here is to look at what are the skills that are going to take us then forward into adulthood that we can then use to stay fit and healthy as well. So the one thing that I'm encouraging kids to, if they have the space, is to learn how to ride a bike. Because there's two skills that we have that if we don't have them by the time an adult, we very, very rarely acquire them. One is riding a bike, and the other one is learning how to swim. Now, I know it's a bit hard to learn how to swim given the constraints we have now, but this is an opportunity for kids to learn how to ride a bike, because if you can learn to ride a bike as a child, again, you'll carry that through. And that's just another opportunity for you to stay fit and healthy later on in life as an adult.
Okay. Very interesting that you spoke about foundation skills, John, because while we've been conducting these online coaching classes for football and basketball and various other sports that children typically play in school, some parents have come back to us and say, why are you teaching them football online? Why are you teaching them basketball skills online? So are there different perspectives on this? What would be your message to parents when, these kind of online classes are being done for specifically to sports like football and basketball, which you wouldn't play online?
Yeah, I think for parents, again, I come back to the same thing as time. If a child really wants to take up a sport, then obviously skills are involved in that sport. And given the time that we allocate either in school or after school to skill acquisition, there's very limited time for the child to acquire those skills effectively during those periods. So we need to then now use this period and this time, because we have extra time, to work on the skill acquisition side of the games. These are the foundations of sport as well. Obviously, we have the physical foundations, but then we have the skill foundations as well. So this is an opportunity for skill acquisition. And so my messaging consistently is this is the period that you can start separating yourself from everybody else. So when you go back to a normal sort of sporting world and sporting environment, you want to be ahead of everybody else, not the same as everybody else. And this is the perfect opportunity to do it. My messaging to all my athletes here overseas, to the Steve Smiths of the world, to the Butlers of the world, to the Archers, to the Samsons, to the Watsons, whoever they may be, is this is the opportunity to separate yourself from everybody else. This is the opportunity to work on those 1% we always talk about, that we never get time to properly work on, which is the mental side of the game and the skill side of the game. So now's your opportunity to do it. So for parents, it really is a time for your child to start separating themselves from everybody else because they've got time to practice skill. So the messaging is the same for these kids as it is for all the other athletes that I'm working with. We have the time, let's make the most of it. And the children will thank you for it later when they go back to their academies or whatever it is. They'll be way ahead of everybody else.
That's great advice, John, because that's the same approach that we've taken when we're doing the daily catch up on sports. And the whole idea is that, and some of the things that we've seen is that the coaches that we're working with have come up with some really, really innovative ways of teaching skills to children, because the only way they can do it is through a Zoom class or something like that.
Yeah.
And the kind of innovation we're seeing is just brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Excellent. And, we need to understand that like I said, there are limitations at the moment. But it's who's willing to look beyond those limitations and find a way are the ones who are going to come out ahead in the end. This is all about challenging ourselves. And this makes me think of just a really interesting conversation I had with Greg Chappell, the great Greg Chappell, just recently about, using this time again to separate yourself from everybody else. And he talks about the best cricketers in the world, and often the best athletes in the world, are the ones who are not afraid to remove themselves from their comfort zones more often than others. Now, COVID-19 has taken all of us out of our comfort zone. There's no doubt about that. So we need to, even as parents, as children, whoever, we just got to embrace that. Okay, and use this time in this uncomfortable place to start growing in some other areas. Okay, so if you'll then become better at coming out of your comfort zone, is what I'm trying to say. And it leads me back to another point that I always raise with young athletes, and particularly young kids, which was told to me by a 3-time Olympic gold shooting medalist, is that if you're the best in the room, you're in the wrong room. Okay, so this is coming from a guy who had to leave his country because he was the best in the country at shooting in order to challenge himself better and to grow. Okay, so we're now in a position to remove ourselves from our comfort zones because we're forced into that, and use this opportunity to challenge yourself beyond that comfort zone and start growing. And I think that's what I'm saying before about these are the 1%ers that when we come out of this at the other end, these kids are going to be better, stronger mentally. They're going to have better strategies in place for challenges that are going to come along in their everyday lives. So this is the time to work on those little things. And when it comes from people like Greg Chappell and some of these guys who, were the best in the world, it really makes you think that now is the opportunity to start working on some of these smaller things.
Great. That's great advice, John. Moving on, another topic which I thought we should talk about today is this whole area of nutrition.
Wonderful.
Again, poor children are trapped at home. They are getting bored. The tendency would be to reach out and consume some junk food, or eat some chips, or consume some colas or something like that. So how important is nutrition in the overall well-being? I mean, we know it's important, but how important is nutrition? And do you have any suggestions or recommendations to parents in terms of what kind of power foods or nutrition-rich foods can they make sure that their children get during these times?
Sure. You obviously know that nutrition is one of my favorite topics, and ask any athlete that I work with and any sports person I work with, I know that this is probably the first thing that I always tackle with them is their nutrition. Because without a sound nutrition basis, again, we talked about foundations earlier, the foundation for everything is nutrition. And particularly relevant to this point in time, like I said earlier, is because of the immunity component. Okay, so immunity and health. We know there's a direct relationship, which they're investigating in the UK now, between being obese and COVID-19 morbidity rates. And also immunity. So we all want to be physically healthy. We all want to have robust immune systems functioning efficiently at the moment. And they're driven by, like I said before, predominantly two things. One being exercise, like we discussed, and the other being nutrition. So that underpins everything for me, especially during this period of lockdown. Now, what I say, first of all, to kids and to anybody that I'm talking with, particularly parents, is you need to understand, first of all, there's two things you need to understand. Hunger versus cravings, okay? Now, we need to understand what is the difference between those two, because that effectively what underpins the conversation of nutrition. Now, hunger, the human body doesn't get hungry physiologically in under 12 to 18 hours. So if you're feeling hungry in under 12 hours, it's probably not hunger as such. It's probably a craving for something. And it's normally something that we're addicted to, or something that it triggers the reward center in our brain, okay? And more often than not, that is sugar, or something that raises our blood glucose. Now, the reason why I've come to this point in the conversation is because I think one of the things we've got to look at is sugar. And this is the perfect time to talk about it. It's a perfect time to start practicing, so limiting our sugar intakes. And I'll spend a little bit of time on this conversation of sugar, because sugar is at the core of what we call inflammation. Okay, and inflammation is the source of all disease. Okay, sugar is what triggers those reward centers in the brain, which make us crave. All right, so that is the basis for addiction. Okay, we know that sugar triggers the same reward center in the brain as cocaine and heroin. Okay, so there is an addictive process to this. We know that sugar reduces the effectiveness of vitamin C. Okay, they both compete for the same receptor site on the cell. So if you've got a high sugar diet and you're taking vitamin C thinking that vitamin C is going to help you with your immunity, then it's not going to work. Vitamin C is very important for immunity, but it can't compete with sugar or glucose. Okay, so it reduces the effectiveness of vitamin C and therefore your immunity. Sugar sticks to everything. It's called glycation, and it sticks to all our vessels, kidney vessels, etc. But that's another story. But predominantly what I'm trying to say is it decreases immunity. It binds to those proteins which form our antibodies, okay, and causes them to not function efficiently. And then most importantly, it's sugar that makes you put on weight, okay? Because what happens is when blood glucose goes up and we're not exercising and we're not doing anything, the body has to convert it and store it as fat. Okay, so that's why I'm sort of quite heavy on the sugar conversation, particularly during this period. It's the source of addiction, it's the source of inflammation, it's the source of weight gain, and it's the source of poor cognitive function. Okay, so on the back of that, I'd be steering my kids away from sugar and what we call processed foods. So therefore, it comes back to the conversation around, well, what should we be eating? So I talk about anti-inflammatory foods. That should be the foundations of what we're all eating. So that's effectively real foods, non-processed and non-sugar. Okay, and we know now the non-sugar conversation why we had that. So therefore, what would a sort of a COVID-19 diet look like? And it was interesting talking to Peter Bruckner. You know, Peter Bruckner is the Australian cricket team doctor. He was the Liverpool football team doctor and the world's most prominent sports physician. And he was saying that the best diet for all of us at the moment is what we call a low carbohydrate, higher protein, healthy fat diet. Okay, so effectively it's a real food diet. Healthy fat, so that's things like eggs, seafood, coconut oil, olive oil, nuts, ghee, yogurts, milks, cheeses, things like that. They're the healthy fats. They're the building blocks for immunity. Okay, so we need to be loading up on healthy fats. We need to be loading up on healthy, what we call slow complex carbohydrates. So that's lots of vegetables, particularly your green vegetables and your green leafy vegetables. And you can also include in those things like sweet potato, garlic, non-processed oats, mushrooms. I said nuts before, but include your nuts. And then things like your high fiber fruits. I don't have a problem with kids eating fruit, but as long as it's the whole fruit. I do have a problem with kids just drinking fruit juice, because that is just pure fructose, which goes straight to the liver and then gets converted straight to fat without any effect anywhere else except a liver load. So high fiber fruits such as apple, pear, orange, sweet lime, guava, papaya, all the berries are fine, okay? And then, like I said, if we're eating carbohydrates, I'd be backing off on the amount of carbohydrate we're eating, because that just raises blood glucose. And if we're not using glucose as an energy source to run and jump and hop and do those things, then it has to be stored as fat, okay? So we'll put on weight. So if we're going to eat carbohydrates, make sure that they're complex, okay? That means they have a low glycemic index, they're high in fiber, and effectively they're what we call slow carbohydrates. So that's your traditional grains, jura, bajra, nachni, ragi, unprocessed oats, things like lentils, buckwheat, quinoa, all your vegetables, things like that. So let's load our kids up on those, okay? Where possible, please avoid wheat and wheat flours. One, because they have a very high blood glucose response and rapid blood glucose response, which is what we don't want. And also wheat is very inflammatory. Remember I said before that inflammation is the source of all disease. Okay, so let's back off a little bit on our wheat intake and go back to our traditional grains, okay? So that's sort of, I've nutshelled it a little bit, but if we can keep sort of real food, that's non-processed, low sugar, and anti-inflammatory at the core of our decision-making around food, then I think that's, you know, we can't go wrong. And then on the back of that, I think we talk a lot about supplements, and I get asked a lot about, you know, supplementation. What should our kids be supplemented on? There are probably a few in this period of time. Normally I won't push too many supplements. So it's not so much the supplements, it's more about the additions that we can start adding in. So I want to start adding in things like haldi or turmeric, ginger, lemon, echinacea, primarily because they're very, very good for the immune system, and they're also anti-inflammatory. So that grouping, absolutely. Pre and probiotics for our tummies. So good yogurts, healthy desi yogurts, desi curds, desi ghee, very, very good for our gut. Okay, because that also will boost immunity and make sure that you're absorbing all the right nutrition. I would up our vitamin C dose at this point in time because its relationship to immunity, but definitely don't be taking vitamin C with sugar. Like I said before, it makes it ineffective. And we may need to supplement with vitamin D3 because of our lack of exposure or access to sunshine, possibly. And then the other one that we may want to be looking closely at is our omega-3s. Again, omega-3s are the healthy fats, and they're the building blocks of immunity and cognitive function, okay, so brain function. So your healthy fat, vitamin D3, vitamin C, pre and probiotics, and then some of our more ancient remedies, turmeric, haldi, ginger, lemon, echinacea, things like that. So that's probably all I'll say on the nutrition side, but it is of enormous importance, particularly during this period when activity levels are down. So to give you a small example, 2 pieces of white toast, or any toast really that's made of wheat, raises your blood glucose the equivalent of about 6 teaspoons of sugar. Okay, and the same thing goes for a bowl of white rice. So 1 bowl of white rice raises your blood glucose the equivalent of about 9 teaspoons of sugar. Now, in order to burn off that amount of energy, because that's energy, you would need to run about between 6 and 8 kilometers to burn off that amount of energy. Now, at the moment, hardly any of us are doing that because of the constraints of COVID-19. So what does the body have to do with that? It has to store it. It has to convert it and store it as fat in order to keep your blood glucose levels down. Okay, that's what insulin's job is. So now is the time to have the conversation around these things. So instead of having that big bowl of white rice, have a smaller bowl of brown rice or black rice or red rice or something with more fiber so you don't get the big uptick in blood glucose. So these are just little conversations that we can now have. And the best time to have these conversations, I think, is around the dinner table. We've got the time, and we now got the place to now bring food back to the dinner table. That often doesn't happen anymore. But the dinner table is the centerpiece of conversation. So there's a discipline around that. There's a discovery around that. And it becomes part of routine. And routine is often what's missing during periods like this. So I think the family mealtime and making that a defined point in the day to get the family together and eat healthy food is a really, really good start.
Agreed, John. And I think that's very good advice in terms of the diet and the composition and what kind of foods parents should be giving their children.
Yes.
Speaking from personal experience, given the fact that a lot of stores and a lot of places have been shut down, our supply of processed foods has completely run out. And we are having to innovate in the house to try and give, interesting homemade snacks to the children, which are healthy.
Excellent. And look, it's about being creative as well. And another message that we're delivering to our players is that use this time to try and be creative in another environment. And another environment meaning another room in this case. So make the kitchen that room where you can be more creative. And I think it's an incredible opportunity for kids to learn how to cook.
Yeah.
Because it's an amazing skill to have. It's an amazing discipline. And it allows you to be creative. There's trial and error involved, which is what we all need. There's going to be failure involved, which is what we all need. But ultimately, we're creating something in a different environment. So again, these are those strategies that I talked about before that we can then take post-COVID life and be better off. So use this time to learn something like the skill of cooking. Be creative and be in there using traditional methods. Start talking to your grandparents and your parents about what they were cooking when they were kids. What were the mediums they were cooking in? I bet you it wasn't all the fake hydrogenated oils now. It would have been back to your desi ghees, your coconut oils, all those wonderful things that they all cooked in. This is the time to go back to real food and traditional processes of food, of making food, and use that as an experience for your children and also for yourself, but also the beginning of perhaps the health journey that you can all embark on.
That's great advice, and I really love this idea of saying teach children how to cook. Let them get in the kitchen and see what goes into making some of the food that they eat, and they might learn a lot in the process. Yeah,
it's a great stress buster. I mean, we're using it as one of the remedies we have, for busting stress. So fantastic.
So moving on to the last word that you use, which is the word stress. One of the other things that is constantly plays on our mind is how do we make sure how do we take care of the mental well-being of our children, right? And there one of the things that we know is that when we do our online classes, be it for academics or be it for physical exercise, one of the good things that everyone likes is to be able to see their friends, on the screen, because they're not able to meet them physically, but at least they get to see them virtually, and even just seeing them virtually and interacting with them for a few minutes kind of reduces their stress, gives them some social context. So just expanding on that, is there anything that you would recommend for how children can bleed their stress, how they can bleed the boredom that is building inside them? Any techniques, any specific exercises, anything that you would recommend for parents and for children?
Yes. And it's a really interesting point. And we often forget to bring kids into the conversation of stress and mental health, because we assume that they're resilient and they're robust, but often they're not, and they may not display it as obviously as perhaps adults do, but it's often there underlying. So stress is a big topic, and we need to address it. Firstly, I want to say that stress lowers immunity. So again, coming back to the immunity conversation, stress immediately lowers immunity. On the back of stress, we have fear. We're surrounded by fear of the unknown, fear of the disease, fear of getting unwell. And we know that fear also lowers immunity. So it lowers immunity by raising a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is also extremely inflammatory. So, and cortisol also is connected to weight gain. So, we come back to some of the same, very similar sort of topics that we were on before. So we really do need to address it. And that's why we need to, because the underlying thing here is obviously stress. And we need to recognize it not just in ourselves, but also in others around us, particularly in our children. So some of the things that we talk about, ways of overcoming this, and there's certainly a lot of strategies. Cooking was one that we just talked about. The other one is, and I think this should be integrated and incorporated at some level in some of the online platforms that we have, is the breathing methods and some of our traditional breathing methods, and going back to our yogic practices, and not just for the physical side, but for the breathing side to reduce stress as well. So the ones that I use, the Anulom Vilom, I think is particularly valuable here. Couple buddies. Some of the others that I'm using is there's an extreme athlete from Europe called Wim Hof. I'm using a lot of his techniques, and the players are using those as well, plus some of the breath hold apnea free diving techniques that the free divers use. So all these are a twofold effect. One is to obviously boost our immunity, but the other is to improve our respiratory systems and make them more robust, which again, we're surrounded by respiratory disease. So I think breathing and breathing practices for our kids should be integrated into the physical exercise platform at some level. So that's definitely there. You talked about getting online, visual contact, talking to friends, getting connected, particularly with their peers. And that can be through interacting one-on-one in conversation, but also having online games with their friends. But as long as there's a visual contact, I think that's really important. At some level, we may need to talk to a professional, and that goes for kids as well, that if some kids are really struggling, then there are professional outlets as well that we can tap into if required. Starting on some of the basics of meditation, for some of the older kids particularly, this is a nice way to start introducing some of those practices because of the benefits that it has. Routine, the best way, the exercise I think is a brilliant one. We've talked a bit about that as a distraction therapy, but the next best thing I think is around having a routine for our kids. And I say this, because I work with athletes all the time, but kids particularly, they're so used to having a routine, particularly on school days. And then suddenly there is no routine, and it can become quite confusing for many, and many lose their way as a result, because there's no fixed start to their day, and there's certainly no fixed end really to our day. And for many, that can be very difficult to adjust to. So we need to find ways of getting routine and sticking to those routines, and that also helps with managing stress. But probably the one that I like to really come back to, and I'm really particular about, is sleep. And this goes for kids, it goes for adults, it goes for athletes, it goes for whoever. But if we're not getting good sleep, then we're in big trouble. Because again, like nutrition, it sort of underpins wellness and it underpins health. So we really should be focusing on sleep, particularly with our kids. And there's a number of reasons for that. One being that, we know that cognitive performance, mood, glucose metabolism, appetite regulation, immune function, all these things are compromised, particularly in adults who are getting under 6 hours of sleep a night for 4 or more consecutive nights, and in kids who are consistently getting under 8 hours a night. So we need to keep that, at the forefront of every discussion we have through these platforms. So sleep, kids' ability to perform complex tasks are affected. We know about inattention, we know about distraction, increased in errors, particularly for adults, and injuries in the workplace. We see those numbers go up when there's sleep deprivation. Same thing for athletes. Injury rates go up with athletes if they're not sleeping. Immunity, your whole immunity is built around your T cells, and sleep, or adequate sleep, improves the function of your T cells, so therefore immunity goes up. But also when you're not sleeping, it goes down. We talked earlier about that stress hormone cortisol, and how it can make you put on weight, and that's through other hormones one's called ghrelin, another one's called leptin. But all these things sort of tie in. So the strategies that I say to the players is reading is a really good one, okay, to help with sleep. Never use a screen under 30 minutes before going to bed because of the blue light effect on exciting the brain. Certainly reduce your sugar intake, given that that's extremely excitatory. So looking at your nutrition will help with your sleep, absolutely. For eating, try not to eat in under sort of around 2 hours before going to sleep. Okay, our body finds it really difficult to digest food and get deep sleep at the same time. So I'll definitely be looking at your sleep timing. Reduce caffeine and tea intakes. We know that they're both can stop you from sleeping. So stop that after mid-afternoon time. Exercise, again, is great for sleep, but not under 2 hours before your sleep time. And then having that routine. Remember, I talked about having that routine. And ideally, for people who don't sleep well, waking up earlier is actually better for you. It's proven that people with insomnia or who struggle to sleep don't sleep in. It's the worst thing you can do. So get up earlier, set your routine, and then get going. And then the environment, cool, dark, no lights, and definitely no distractions. So don't have a buzzing phone. So a phone that buzzes in the night, it may not wake you into awakeness, but it will take you out of your deep sleeps and your REM sleeps back into a light sleep. So even just having a phone next to you, if it's vibrating, even if it's not on a ringer and you don't wake, it still affects the quality of sleep you have. So remove those things from the vicinity. So there's a few little strategies. And then nutrition, again, the foods that help you sleep are things like I said, good fats. So things like eggs help you, fatty fish. We're talking about foods that are high in tryptophans and serotonin and melatonin. So warm milk, almonds, walnuts, kiwi fruit, chamomile tea, leafy vegetables. So they're all the things that have melatonin, serotonin, and what we call tryptophans in them, which will help us to sleep. So again, we come back to another conversation around nutrition for sleep. I mentioned earlier that it's the foundation pretty much for everything. And, again, most conversations seem to come back to a nutritional base, but particularly in this case as well, with managing stress, managing sleep, and therefore lifestyle.
Okay. So just one quick question on sleep. You talked about, children should get at least 8 hours of sleep. And if they don't sleep enough, then it begins to impact their cognitive ability. Is there a flip side? As in, of course, kids are at home most of the time. And if they're bored and they end up oversleeping most days, does that have are there any negatives to oversleeping?
Yeah, it's more, there's no negatives to oversleeping as such, in that it takes out time from other activities that could be beneficial as well, like physical activity, exercising your brain, things like that. So, we talk about kids, depends on the age bracket, but ideally kids should not be getting, definitely not under 8 hours, but ideally around 10 hours a night minimum, especially for the younger kids, because that's when we grow. All our growth is done during sleeping. So that's really important that sleep is monitored, and then the type of sleep is monitored as well. So, in answer to your question, can you sleep too much? The danger of that is then becomes a habit. And that can then, when kids go back to school and go back to normal routines that we were talking about before, it then is still part of that habit. So then may start being detrimental to the new environments that they're going back to because they can't sleep. So, I wouldn't be encouraging kids to sleep, more than 12 hours a day, but do remember that that's when we grow. That's when obviously our brains sort of rejuvenate and regenerate. But on the other side, we need to counteract that with time to stress our systems as well. Now, by that, I mean physical stress, because that's when tendons grow, that's when bone growth occurs, that's when we start functioning and stimulating our minds again. So we need an opportunity to stress the system in order to grow at some level, but then we also need the rest or recovery period for that to be maximized. So again, we talked right at the start of this around balance and finding that balance for that child, and that is going to be different for certain children, but there are certain parameters that we need to be looking at, particularly when it comes to sleep and sleep timing.
Okay. So this is one question which I wanted to ask, which is that, a few weeks back we saw Federer sending around some skills challenge where he was bouncing a ball off his racket. Mm-hmm. And then a few days back we saw Yuvraj sending out a cricket bat challenge, which Sachin responded to. And a lot of these challenges seem to be going viral on social media. So I'm wondering, elite athletes, a lot of whom that you would know personally, would be facing the same challenges that our kids are facing, because they're used to being physically active all the time, taking part in tournaments, gutting it out, and very, very high levels of physical exertion. And all of a sudden they're trapped at home with no tournaments to play. So, what are the principles we can take away from how elite athletes are coping with the lockdown and use it for our children?
Yeah, exactly the same. And, consistently through this talk, I've been mentioning, our athletes and what they're doing. And it's pretty much exactly the same things that we're encouraging our kids to do, because they're facing very similar issues, being stimulated, keeping their mind stimulated, keep themselves physically adjusted to what's going to happen post-COVID as well. Now, they've all got to be ready to go. Once the bans are lifted and sport starts again, all of these guys, the elite level guys, need to be able to switch on and go. So physically, mentally, everything, and to some extent skill. So yes, there is a big focus on the skill, and we're trying to make fun of it. We're trying to make games out of it to keep kids engaged. And one of the main reasons why we're getting some of the, the Butlers of the world, and through our platform, Rajasthan Royals, we're trying to get some of the elite players to get the messaging out to kids that we're doing it. So it's just as important for you to do it. And so they're helping us to deliver some of these really simple messages that we've been talking about today around keeping active, keeping mobile, practicing your skills, using this opportunity to build and grow in other areas. But at the same time, understanding that we're all going through something that we haven't been through before, and it's testing us all mentally, and that at some point it's okay not to be motivated, particularly for athletes who are always used to having a destination. There's always something they're striving for, would be a match or a competition or something. And suddenly that's not there anymore. So motivation is a big thing, and we're going to see it with our kids as well. So it's okay to go through periods of not being motivated, not wanting to do too much. That's okay as well, because all of us at some point are going to need to recharge. So if that means taking time away from some of the physical stuff that we've been setting the players, then that's okay. You're not going to lose too much physically if you have 3 or 4 days off. If it means recharging you mentally, then you're going to get significant benefit out of having those 3 or 4 days off, because you're recharging your mind. If your mind's not recharged, then physically you're going to switch off anyway. Okay, so I think that's really important to understand that this is an opportunity to find ways to switch off. This is an opportunity for you to explore what are the things that I like to do, and get away from the game. These are the opportunities for kids, particularly, to find hobbies and find things that they really enjoy, that they can switch off when they're in other environments mentally. So we're encouraging particularly the elite players, this is the time to start reading. This is the time to start playing games. This is the time to start finding some of those hobbies. We talked about going to the kitchen and cooking, things like that. And most of them are doing it and really, really enjoying it. So that's their way of escaping. Reading, we're really encouraging the reading, and I'm really encouraging with our kids as well. One of the reasons is because we're so used to having a screen. We're so used to things being delivered to us visually, and we don't have to think or create a picture in our mind anymore. And I talked earlier about who are the best sports people in the world are the ones that are able to take themselves out of comfort zones. Well, also the best sports people in the world are the ones who have the ability to build and visualize scenarios in their own mind. Okay, and reading helps us do that. When we read, we have to formulate a picture. We have to visualize a scenario. Okay, so this is a great opportunity to practice that even. And for kids, it's particularly important that they learn how to read and visualize and create, mental pictures. Because if they want to go on and be a sports person, this is an incredibly valuable tool that they're going to need to build anyway. So, this is a chance to do that. This is a chance to start making decisions in a hostile environment. And for sports people out there, there's going to be no more hostile and uncertain environment on a sports field than what we're, encountering right here and now in the field of this battle. Okay, so again, this is the time to start working on those decision-making strategies that you're going to take into the real world beyond COVID-19. So there's patience involved, there's discipline involved, there's developing routines, all these things that are going to be of value to our children and to our sports people post-COVID-19. Now is the chance to work on dealing with that.
Perfect. On a lighter note, I think we've all been very amused to see David Warner develop into a dancer.
Bollywood dancer. Yeah. Look, if dance is the way to move, then get our kids dancing. I don't care how they move. If it's dancing, if it's rap, if it's bebopping, whatever they call it, I don't care. As long as they're moving. And that's why I'm glad to see that, I can tell you right now, for David to do that, he's taken himself out of his comfort zone. So he's used this opportunity to take himself into a space that he's not comfortable at all. Dancing, being on the camera. He's not great. Well, previously he wasn't great at that. So now this is his opportunity to grow in another area.
Correct.
So again, if it's dance, whatever it is, I don't care. Get moving and get out of your comfort zone.
Okay. Some questions coming in, John. One of the questions is, what is the best exercise regime for a toddler? Interesting question.
Yeah, so toddlers are more used to the constraints of an environment than perhaps older kids. So the environment sort of conversation won't change so much for a toddler, except the exposure to the outside world. So we can still be very creative we talked earlier about the foundation skills for kids. So we can still be very creative ensuring that they are working on their foundation skills. So exposing them to different surfaces. So I think kids, particularly toddlers, shouldn't wear shoes, because that's where your first, what we call your proprioceptive sort of mechanisms are put in place. Your stability mechanisms, your feedback mechanisms, your sensory receptors are all stimulated, particularly through the feet. So I'd make sure the kids aren't wearing shoes at all in the house or around the house. One, exposing them to different surfaces. So if there's a different carpet, different hard surfaces, soft surfaces. One, because it's stimulation, but it's also working on balance skills. Now is the time for toddlers to explore the environment that we can create for them. So we may need to create certain environments that involve play, but keeping in mind that we're trying to stimulate and not miss out on these kids getting the foundations of balance, coordination, sensation, sensory reception, and then also what we call resistance. So working against resistance. So them pulling, pushing, hopping, jumping if they can, if they're upright. These are the foundation skills that anybody can do anywhere. But the one thing I want to encourage all parents to do, particularly the younger toddlers, is to expose them to different surfaces, because that is what eventually gives you your sensory feedback to the brain from the lower limbs, which therefore improves coordination, balance, etc., etc.
Okay. Some more questions coming in, John. Sometimes when we do these online sports sessions with our children, they don't have the equipment at home, right? And then parents are wondering, what is the value of doing a football session or a basketball session if the child doesn't have the football or the basketball at home. So do you see any value in doing these kind of sessions?
Look, I've always said that, any movement, any skill acquisition opportunity is one that cannot be missed because we have the time to work on it. So all you need effectively for a basketball is a basketball and some obstacles, which you can create around the house. So this is the opportunity not just to work on the basketball ball skills, but this is the opportunity to work on the foundation skills that allow you to be better at those skills when you have a basketball in your hand or a football at your feet. So you'll never be a good basketball if you don't have coordination, if you're not good on what we call single leg stability, if you're not balanced, okay, you can't run, you can't jump, you can't squat. So you can have the best hand skills in the world as a basketballer, but if you don't have the foundation skills in place, you'll never be able to deliver on that skill. So I talked earlier about using this opportunity to build the foundations, to work on your hopping, your jumping, your skipping, your stairs, your lower limb strength, your single leg stability, your balance, your coordination, working around obstacles, working on zigzags, working on lunge walking, using your own body weight as forms of resistance. The word that I always use is, your own body is effectively your gymnasium for this period of time. Okay, you don't need to look beyond your own body because your body weight resistance is all you need at this point, particularly for kids. Now, you can use your basketball and be creative, and that's where some of the sports village coaches need to be creative, and we'll start creating more engaging, fun activities where kids will use the ball, but to practice some of their skills as well. So, their bouncing skills, their dribbling skills, their throwing skills. Effectively, all you need is a wall or a ground to work, a floor to work on. So the onus then is back on us being more creative in the delivery. But at the end of the day, there's no shortage of things to do for kids during this period of time. It's how we deliver them and the messaging that goes with the delivery. And for parents to understand that the reason why we're doing this, and this is the outcome as a result. That's the most important thing actually at this point in time. So parents understanding there's a reason to it and there's an outcome to it. Right. That is what we need to ensure. And that's why I'm here today, is to ensure that they understand that there's a reason why we're doing this. And then the outcome is that when they go back to that sport or that skill or the playground or whatever it may be in a normal post-COVID world, they'll be far better off because of it.
So, just to kind of build on that, one of our sports coaches, I think the cricket coach, some of the children didn't have the equipment at home. They didn't have the bats at home. So they said, how do we kind of train? So the coach actually said, do you have a broom at home? So he actually took the broom handle and he's teaching them how to bat.
Well, the greatest cricketer of all time only used a stump for the majority of the time in practice. So Sir Donald Bradman, and I was very fortunate enough to grew up living next door to Sir Donald. He was my direct neighbor for 6 years as a kid. And so I had direct access to Sir Donald Bradman for many years. Probably the most fortunate person because of that. But he always talked about, you have to make do and you have to find a way, because not every kid is going to have the opportunity to have a bat or a ball in their hand. So what can we do? And so that's a wonderful suggestion. Just get a broom handle and practice with a broom handle. And I can tell you, if you practice with a broom handle, if it's good enough for Sir Donald Bradman, it's good enough for any of us, then you're suddenly working with probably 1/4 or 1/5 of the surface area of a normal cricket bat. If you're going to hit a ball consistently with a broom handle, imagine how easy it's going to be when you go back and start playing cricket with a normal cricket bat. So again, this is all about improvisation. This is all about us coming up with strategies. And that's a wonderful suggestion from that coach. And I'm really proud to say that, you know, there are people in the system who can give those ideas and strategies to not have an excuse not to do it. That's my point, is that we have to find a way. We can't let space be a constraint or an excuse. We can't let equipment be a constraint or an excuse. We have to find a way, because at the end of the day, it's in the best interest of our kids. And we talk about, I'm always talking in my world about asset management. You know, my IPL players, you know, who we pay 15 crores a season to, you know, we pay 15 crores a season to. They're assets. They're serious assets. Now, I got to get a return on that asset. Like any businessman needs to get a return on asset. Well, we need to look at our kids as assets as well. And if we want our kids to grow up healthy and engaged and sporty, if that's the case, then we need to invest in them now. Okay, we need to be creative around that investment. And so if the only message you take away from today is that they are assets, and this is the time to build our assets, work our assets, and to make sure that we create the opportunities for them to express themselves, either physically or otherwise, to the best of their ability during this period of confinement. That's our job.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for those wonderful insights. I think my big takeaway from the session with you is the story about Nelson Mandela and how he kind of survived years and years of confinement. We've just been through 2 months of a lockdown. So if Mandela could do it, I'm sure we can. And we have to make exercise a very critical part of our daily routine, which will help us not just from a physical perspective, but from a cognitive perspective also.
Totally agree. And so I encourage the kids out there to go and read up on Nelson Mandela's life. He wrote a magnificent book called Walk to Freedom, but just go and look up where he lived, how he got through his routines and how important it was to him. Go and look at people like the space. I've been reading a lot about the space shuttle guys and the guys living on the space stations and how important exercise is for them, for their cognitive function, for their physical abilities. They're all in confined spaces. They're finding ways to do it. I went back and read about, you know, how the cricketers before air travel, you know, it was a 2-month ship ride to England to go and play the series against England. What did they do on the ship? How did they exercise on those ships during that period of time? So there's lots of stories out there for kids to go out and explore on their own about other examples of confinement and constraints and how they overcame them. I think that's a wonderful opportunity, a learning opportunity for these kids as well.
Thank you so much, John. It was a really, really wonderful session, hearing to your views on various things that we covered: sleep, nutrition, exercise. I think everyone who joined this session and those who will watch it later will definitely be enriched by your thoughts. Thank you so much, and we'll continue this conversation later.
Anytime. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Si.
Bye.
Thank you so much.